Welcome to today's Explainer. We're diving straight into a totally captivating, almost mythic fable that unpacks some seriously heavy themes of existentialism and nihilism. I want you to picture this like a scene from a graphic novel. We open in this dark, quiet room. Sitting there is the Dark Sage, a weary, incredibly clear-sighted older man. Suddenly, his peaceful solitude is crashed by the youth. Now, this is a young man who is practically vibrating with arrogant, unyielding optimism. He bursts in, completely determined to prove that his hope is a way stronger argument than the sage's so-called despair. Right off the bat, we get this quote that perfectly illustrates their dynamic. "I promise to listen as carefully as the sun listens to a man's plans for tomorrow." Talk about a cold reception, right? You see, the youth's toxic optimism has barged into the room with the aggressive, relentless energy of an unpaid debt collector. He is absolutely certain he's right. But the sage, he isn't angry. He just already knows exactly how this argument is going to end. Section 1. The Clerk and the Engine. So the sage goes right for the jugular. He completely challenges the very foundation of the youth's worldview. He points out this unspoken assumption we all kind of have, the idea that suffering is a trial set by a caring hand, made difficult right now so it can be perfectly explained to us later on. And this brings us to a massive concept, the ledger. It's this comfortable little fiction that some cosmic author is keeping a careful tally of all our pain, our effort, our patience, and that eventually the scales are going to balance. I want you to literally pause and ask yourself right now, what receipts are you secretly holding on to? What hardships are you putting up with today just because you assume the universe is quietly preparing a big settlement for you tomorrow? To completely dismantle this idea of the ledger, the sage introduces two entirely different philosophers. First up is the biblical writer Koheleth. Now, if you look at the philology here, Koheleth translates from the original Hebrew roughly to the assembler or the teacher, someone who gathers wisdom. And here's the thing. He actually did assume the world had an author. He expected, like any reasonable clerk would, that his ledger would eventually balance out. But it didn't. He watched the wicked prosper and the righteous starve. And he wrote his entire book in the profound, crushing disappointment of realizing that the sun files no complaints, and it offers absolutely no appeals. Then, the sage pivots to a much colder diagnosis with the philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer. Now, Schopenhauer, unlike Koheleth, never expected a ledger in the first place. He didn't see suffering as some meaningful test from a caring teacher. To him, it was just friction. It's the ordinary, inescapable cost of a will, this internal engine of desire that just wants, and wants forever, without any pause and without grading the results. To put it simply, Schopenhauer didn't think suffering was a cosmic trial. He saw it literally as the design specification of human appetite. So whether you're looking at Koheleth, the disappointed clerk, or Schopenhauer, the exhausted engine, you end up arriving at the exact same devastating conclusion. There is no caring hand holding the pen. The hand you were told to expect was never actually keeping score. And as the sage lays this out so plainly, you can actually see the very first crack starting to form in the youth's arrogant certainty. Section 2. Two tables, no ladder. But the youth, he is not ready to give up yet. He makes this desperate pivot. He argues, okay, even if the ledger doesn't balance perfectly, surely there's a ladder, right? Some higher purpose or grand salvation waiting on the far side of suffering, as long as we endure it well. In response, the sage lays out the only honest paths that actually exist. The first table is Koheleth's existential modesty. Eat your bread, find pleasure in your labor, and just accept this small portion because no grander meal was ever coming. The second table is Schopenhauer's nihilistic starvation, refusing the meal completely, renouncing desire entirely so that engine of will finally idles down. But what about the third table, the youth's ladder, where suffering yields a higher reward? Well, the reality is, it's an absolute illusion. And then the sage just completely shatters the youth's hope with his devastating line, "Which of the two remaining paths, then, will you walk, now that the third has been shown to be a mural painted on a wall with no door in it?" Just let that sink in for a second. The salvation this young man has been striving for all his life isn't real. It's essentially just a painting of a door on a solid brick wall. Okay, so the youth is seriously reeling now. His jaw is tight. In this sort of fading, desperate defense, he tries to turn it around and diagnose the sage. He asks, is this dark worldview just the symptom of a melancholic mind? He's basically suggesting the sage only believes all this because sorrow has completely clouded his judgment. But the sage almost smiles at this. He points out that modern instruments actually prove the exact opposite.
The melancholic mind actually guesses its own odds and its own control with way greater accuracy. It is the hopeful mind that takes a wish, inflates it into a likelihood, and then calls that inflation confidence. The sage isn't clouded at all. He is one of the rare few whose glass has actually been wiped perfectly clean. He's just seen the room at its correct, freezing temperature, while everyone else around him insists it's way warmer than the thermometer says it is.
This brings us to a massive turning point in our explainer. The youth's booming optimism, which literally burst into the room earlier, is now standing very quietly by the door. His arrogance is broken. And he asks the most honest question he's asked all night. And if I accept what you're showing me, what does it cost? Section 3. The bill never sent. Accepting this reality? It costs everything. You have to completely let go of everything you were charging to a future that was never actually going to bill you. You lose the comfortable fiction that your effort is being tallied up, which honestly feels exactly like grief at first. And there's a heavy social cost too. Sustainable loneliness. Now, this isolation isn't a punishment. It's just architecture. It is the natural, inevitable distance between someone who has stopped pretending and a world that is still incredibly busy pretending on a very tight schedule. Because let's face it, clear sight is rarely welcome to the dinner table. Living with that clean glass means you lose the ability to perform all those small, necessary optimisms that hold ordinary friendships together. The youth, who is growing quieter by the minute, asks why Schopenhauer demands we give up everything. Why not just see clearly and keep our modest portion of bread? The answer is simple. Schopenhauer didn't trust the bread. Not even a little bit. He was terrified that any satisfaction, however small, just teaches that unyielding will that wanting occasionally pays off. And once you encourage it, the will doesn't know how to want less. So he chose total amputation over careful management. It's a harsh, genuinely terrifying medicine meant to starve the appetite entirely. But remember, Kohelet's path is still very much an option. Kohelet's bread works because Kohelet had already stopped expecting that meal to somehow solve the universe. It isn't a cure for the human condition, right? It is just a moment's honest pleasure, taken entirely without illusion. It absolutely works, but only if you drop the fantasy that the meal has some grand cosmic meaning behind it. Section 4. Descent into quiet acceptance. We have reached the final act of this remarkable fable, and we are watching the youth's physical and psychological descent. The young man who walked in so full of fight, he just sits down uninvited on the cold stone. His shoulders drop. His arrogance literally folds in on itself, like a tent losing its poles one by one, as the sheer existential weight of the sage's words settles deep into his bones. And then he finally speaks. I came to convert you, and I find instead that I do not know which of your two tables I am meant to sit at. The sage gently tells him this isn't a failure. In fact, it's the very first honest sentence the young man has spoken since he arrived. It marks his complete and total surrender to an unvarnished reality. The sage gently explains that the goal tonight was never to force him to choose between Koheleth's modest bread and Schopenhauer's empty table. Not at all. The true victory is simply noticing that the third table, that one set by a caring hand, that imaginary ladder to a higher purpose, was never actually in the room to begin with. The rest of life is really just the long, quiet work of learning to eat or to fast without it. And with that realization, a profound silence settles into the dark room. It settles in like cold into stone. The candle burns low. The youth doesn't argue anymore because he finally gets that he was holding on to an argument he was never going to win. And in finally setting it down, he realizes his arms have been tired for years. The sage just sits there, keeping his small, sufficient vigil over a silence that tells the whole, complete truth without ever having to raise its voice. When the youth finally rises to leave, something fascinating happens. He doesn't thank the sage. And you know what? The sage doesn't expect him to. Why? Because gratitude is just another ledger. It's just another transactional accounting system they simply no longer believe in. The youth steps out into the noisy city, fundamentally changed. He's walking out into a night that asks absolutely nothing of him, and therefore, for the very first time in his life, it owes him nothing to resent. Which leaves us here, at the end of our explainer. The comfortable illusions have been completely stripped away. The cosmic ledger is empty, and that painted door on the wall has been exposed for exactly what it is. So I leave you with this final provocative thought. Now that your glass has been wiped clean, and you know for a fact the third table is an illusion, which of the two remaining tables will you sit at?